The LinkedIn Podcast Network is sponsored by TIAA. TIAA makes you a retirement promise, a promise of a guaranteed retirement paycheck for life. Learn more at TIAA.org/promises pay off.
LinkedIn presents.
I'm Michael Kovnat. This is the Next Big Idea Daily, and it's Wednesday. So when was the last time you thought about yuppies? The image of young urban professionals is not as iconic as it used to be, but trust me, in the 80s, this cohort seemed to be at the center of the culture. How the idealistic hippies became careerist yuppies is the subject of the new book, Triumph of the Yuppies, America, the 80s, and the Creation of an Unequal Nation by Tom McGrath. Tom is the former editor-in-chief of Philadelphia Magazine and former chief content officer of MetroCorp, the parent company of Philadelphia and Boston magazines. Here he is to share 5 of his key insights.
So if you're old enough to remember the 80s, or even if you've only heard about yuppies decades after the fact, the image the term conjures up is of sharply dressed young professionals who were obsessed with money and status. That's not wrong. Yuppies were materialistic, and they valued things that sent a message about who they were, whether it was a Cuisinart in the kitchen, or a BMW in the garage, or the latest gadget from the sharper image. Yuppies preferred the sophistication of city living to the blandness of suburbia. And beginning in the late 70s, they began flooding into previously working-class neighborhoods in cities like New York, Boston, San Francisco, Chicago, Washington, D.C. Yuppies were the original foodies, fueling the latest trendy restaurants. And they were fitness fanatics, turning Jane Fonda into a cultural icon. But in addition to those superficial qualities, yuppies mattered because of something deeper they represented. A divide that was growing within the baby boom generation and in America more broadly, along educational and economic lines. Now, that split had first shown itself in the late 60s with the rise of the counterculture. That's the image we associate with that period, right? But the young people participating in the counterculture, college students, well, they were very much a minority within their own generation. In fact, more than half of baby boomers didn't go to college at all. And while college campuses were erupting, those high school educated boomers were either fighting the war in Vietnam or simply trying to find jobs in working class professions. That divide in economic status, ultimately in cultural sensibility, would only grow as the years went on. The people that we would come to call yuppies first began emerging as a distinct group in the late 1970s. And their existence was really a byproduct of 2 large cultural forces slamming into each other. The first one was the great expectations of the boomer generation. Now, boomers had been raised in the roaring post-World War II economy, and they were told from the moment they were born that the world was pretty much theirs for the taking. They could do, be, dream whatever they wanted. It was a really lovely promise. Unfortunately, by the mid-70s, it was colliding head-on with America's suddenly sputtering economy. Unemployment was high. Inflation was higher. Productivity was declining. The result was that success started to be seen, not incorrectly, as a zero-sum game. In the booming post-war years, incomes in America had grown equally in every economic cohort. Top, middle, bottom. All boats were rising at pretty much the same rate. But in the new economy that was emerging and that would really come to the fore in the 1980s, it was clear that only the best credentialed, most focused, most driven people would thrive. And so, even as one group of baby boomers, the people that didn't go past high school, saw their prospects dim, another group, those who went to college, some of whom, in fact, had actually been part of the counterculture, doubled down on achievement. Many of them went to graduate school. The number of MBA degrees conferred annually more than doubled between 1970 and 1980. While they might have preached peace and love in the 60s and the early 70s, well, now they made themselves comfortable with some of the realities of capitalism. They even began incorporating business speak, phrases like the bottom line, pencil you in, interface, into their everyday language. But they weren't alone in changing. In reaction to the malaise of the 70s, the culture was shifting more broadly. Money was becoming cool. A little paperback called The Official Preppy Handbook became a bestseller, satirizing, but also celebrating, people with a particular kind of old money. Meanwhile, TV shows like Dallas and later Dynasty, well, they showcased new money. And on Wall Street and in corporate America, there was an embrace of a more vigorous, harsher form of capitalism, one that prioritized stockholders over other stakeholders, including employees and the broader community. That would ultimately lead to the elimination or offshoring of millions of good-paying manufacturing jobs and only deepen the country's educational and economic divide. So the word yuppie first appeared in print around 1980, but it wasn't until 3 or 4 years later that yuppies really became a widespread cultural phenomenon. Part of what prompted that was the publication in January 1984 of another tongue-in-cheek little paperback, this one called The Yuppie Handbook. It was a mock how-to guide that broke down the traits, attitudes, and behaviors of this high-achieving, success-oriented new tribe. It sold well, and suddenly the word yuppie was injected into the cultural mainstream. But even more influential when it came to elevating yuppies was the dark horse presidential candidacy that year of Democrat Gary Hart. Hart, who was still only in his 40s, shocked the political establishment by topping frontrunner Walter Mondale in the New Hampshire primary that year. Over the next couple of months, the two men battled it out for the Democratic nomination. Mondale was a classic New Deal Democrat, believed in labor unions, protectionism when it came to trade. While Hart was liberal on social issues, he was more conservative on economic ones, believing that America needs to move on from its manufacturing base to a more tech-based economy. His biggest supporters? Well, they were the college-educated young urban professionals, yuppies, that everyone was talking about, and whose beliefs and policy views aligned far more with Hart than with Mondale. It was a moment that marked yuppies as influential, a new power base in America. Mondale ultimately won the battle for the Democratic nomination, but he pretty much lost the broader war for the soul of the Democratic Party. After Mondale got crushed by Ronald Reagan in that fall's general election, Democrats gradually began moving away from their working class base and the policies that best served those folks, and reinvented itself in the image of yuppies. In 1990, 1 in 4 Democrats had a college degree. Today, it's about 1 in 2. Meanwhile, the percentage of college-educated voters among Republicans has pretty much stayed the same for the last 40 years, about 30%. So by the mid-'80s, a backlash had developed against yuppies. Everyday Americans were rolling their eyes at yuppie self-absorption, yuppie pretension. The word became a pejorative. In fact, yuppie jokes started making the rounds. How many yuppies does it take to screw in a light bulb? 2. One to call the electrician, the other to open the Beaujolais. And yet, yuppies continued to have outsized sway. They were perceived to be the best and brightest of a generation. More important, they had the economic clout. And so many of the trends that they embraced became the norm. In fact, by the mid-'80s, those working-class neighborhoods in places like New York and Chicago that young professionals were settling down in, well, they were rapidly gentrifying, forcing out longtime residents and businesses, setting the stage for the more affluent city centers that we know today. Meanwhile, companies began to pivot to meet the tastes of this new class of upscale consumers. Luxury auto brands like Lexus and Acura were born in the mid-'80s. Food brands like Starbucks and Whole Foods, each of which actually had their roots in the counterculture of the late 60s and early 70s, well, they began to grow, appealing to the sensibilities of a new, more sophisticated consumer. Yuppies might have been a minority, but their taste set the tone for everybody else. Yuppiness as a phenomenon finally came to an end in the aftermath of the 1987 stock market crash, which cost some high-flying yuppies on Wall Street a bundle. In fact, a new wave of yuppie jokes actually started making the rounds that year. What's the difference between a yuppie and a pigeon? A pigeon can still make a deposit on a Porsche. But more importantly, after half a dozen years of big deals, big profits, big attitudes, cultural observers started to predict that financial reckoning the country had gone through, well, it was going to bring about a moral and financial reckoning as well. And yuppies, with all their red suspended smugness and I've got mine, good luck getting yours self-absorption, well, they were going to go the way of flappers, hippies, other ghosts of 20th century past. Did they? Well, the word certainly faded from the culture, as did the suspenders, thank goodness. But it was clear within a few years that no new era had really commenced. No new ethos had taken hold. On the contrary, in its push to revive itself, in its zeal to recapture the dominance and prosperity of that post-war era, in elevating self-interest over any sense of the common good, the country had created a new economic and social order that wouldn't easily be undone. On Wall Street, it took fewer than 20 months for the Dow to recover what it had lost in the stock market crash. And from there, it went on a 10-year bull run. By 2020, it was worth 6 times what it was worth in 1987. Meanwhile, hedge fund managers private equity titans when they regularly make in the tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars per year. Corporate America, the needs of shareholders, not the broader constituency of stakeholders, continues to trump everything else. Stock price, quarter-to-quarter earnings, they drive most decisions. In corporate America, profits increased nearly 1,000% between 1990 and 2020. As for the economic and educational divide that Yuppies personified, well, it's deeper than ever. According to the Economic Policy Institute, between 1979 and 2021, wages for the top 1% of earners in America grew 200%, while wages for the bottom 90% grew just 29%. So much for all boats rising at the same pace. All of this has produced a backlash. On the left, you could see it in movements like Occupy Wall Street, as well as the popularity of politicians like Bernie Sanders. On the right, well, its most obvious incarnation is Donald Trump and the MAGA movement. At its root is a lack of trust among tens of millions of people who felt left behind over the last several decades, because in a lot of ways they have been. Over the last 40 years, a small subset of Americans, call them the 1%, call them the elites, call them yuppies, have created a country that works well for themselves, but not so well for anyone else.
All right, folks. Well, that's our show for today. Whether you're a yuppie, a buppie, a preppy, or a hippie, I hope you'll join us at nextbigideaclub.com. We've got a lot to offer all of you. The curated selection of the best nonfiction books sent right to your door, invitations to special live events, beautiful audio and video masterclasses on everything from psychology to business to creativity. Check it all out at nextbigideaclub.com. And if you like what you see, use the code DAILY for a special discount. That's nextbigideaclub.com and use the code DAILY. I'll be back tomorrow with some big ideas from The Indispensable Right, Free Speech in an Age of Rage. I'm Michael Kovnat. See you tomorrow.